I am resolved. Here we go. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Greatest, highest, I will come to thee. Sing that last verse. I am resolved, and who will go with me? Come, friends, without delay. Taught by the Bible, led by the Spirit, we'll walk the heavenly way. I will hasten to him, hasten so free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. Thank you so much, folks. Thank you.
All right, good evening. It's good to see all of you here. I'm glad that you made it. Let's go ahead and start with the word of prayer tonight. Dear Lord, we thank you and praise you for how good you are to us. We thank you for the opportunity we have to be here tonight. We thank you for the freedoms that you've given to us in our country. We just ask that you would help us tonight to understand your world and help us understand our country. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, I'm going to save time. Theoretically, I'm going to save time at the end for questions. We'll see how far we get, okay? But I don't know. I hope you've learned a lot over the last couple of weeks as we've been looking at the Constitution. Could there be more said on the Constitution? Yes. When I taught government, it took me about 3 months to cover it. That was one class every day for 5 days for 3 months. So there's a lot to be said. We could keep going on more, but we're going to wrap things up tonight by looking at the rest of the Bill of Rights. Okay? Anybody remember what are some of the amendments that make up the Bill of Rights? Timothy, you got one? People. Well, people what?
People have rights.
Okay, people have rights, but what are they? Okay, listen to, yes.
Freedom of religion.
Okay, we have freedom of religion. Which amendment?
Amendment 1.
Amendment 1, good.
In order to maintain a more perfect militia, the right of keeping and bearing arms shall not be infringed.
Okay, it's Amendment 2. You got to work on your memorization, though. Okay, you combine the preamble with Amendment 2. Yes.
I like the 10th. It basically says if it's not in there, you ain't got it.
Okay, except the Supreme Court said it's just a truism and it really doesn't apply. Uh-oh, yeah, we're going to get there. Okay, all right. That's the great way we're ending our class tonight, all right. But any others? Do we know the rest? I guess we better get into it and take a look at our amendments, okay? So this is just a summary of all of our amendments, but we're going past 1 and 2, all right? We spent the last 2 weeks looking at 1 and 2. Amendment number 3 says, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law, okay? This one, I think of all the amendments, this one's probably the least controversial. It simply prohibits the quartering of troops or soldiers in homes without the consent of the owners, nor in time of war, but in a manner prescribed by law. Okay, you're like, all right, what does that have to do with us? If you go back to American history, very simple. When the British were trying to control the colonies, they were just moving their soldiers into people's houses, which was kind of a double-edged sword. It helped them control the people, but it also helped the people know what the soldiers were doing. And so, there's lots of stories about, ladies and servants listening to at the door as the generals are meeting in the next door and taking that information and handing it over to our founding fathers. But as a result, we get the Third Amendment, no quartering of troops in time of peace in people's homes, okay? Amendment number 4 says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effect against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized, okay? So this amendment lets us know that your home is your castle, okay? The federal government can't come to your house and knock on the door and just say, hey, we want to walk in, we want to do whatever we want to do here, okay? There's no unreasonable searches or seizures. They have to have a reason to search your house. Warrants can only be issued upon probable cause. The federal agents need to go to a judge and say, here is the cause that we have a warrant to go into this house, okay? Yes, Olin, you had a question? Okay, that's not necessarily true. They have to show probable cause. And I know, you know, my cousin used to be an assistant district attorney in Berks County, and they do have to come. And I know it's interesting because if you watch the crime shows, who are the successful police officers? The ones that skirt probable cause, right? And oh, this door was left open, and then they opened the door and they solved the crime. You know, they beat up the bad guy. At least Walker, Texas Ranger did all that stuff, okay? But in reality, they need to follow the laws prescribed for them. Yes?
They went on to Marglo, Trump's place there in Florida. They had probable cause that he was hiding papers there.
That is what they have to show probable cause to a judge in order to get that information. Yes. That is required, because if you don't do that, and we'll get to that here in a second, okay? Katz versus the United States is one of the cases. The Supreme Court said that searches conducted outside the judicial process without prior approval by judge or magistrate are per se unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment, subject only to a few established and well-delineated exceptions, all right? So what was happening here, acting on a suspicion that Katz was transmitting gambling information over the phone to clients in other states, federal agents attached an eavesdropping device to the outside of a public phone booth, okay? All of you in the front, that would be on street corners, and people would go and they would put quarters into a slot, and then because you got home from a game and you needed your parents to come pick you up, so you would put the quarter in there and you would hear the dial tone, you would dial the number, and then you could talk to your parents. Yes. Okay, what's that? Okay, so there were buttons that you pushed. There was no screen. You couldn't make it bigger or smaller. You just pushed the buttons after you put your...
That's horrible.
No, there was. You would push 0 and you would get live Siri. And you could ask her questions and she could tell you what to do, okay? They did not, I don't believe the operators told jokes, okay? All right, so, but ask Mr. Groff afterward, okay? Because if anybody joked with an operator. All right, okay, so, but now, once again, this is one of those cases where you got, like, this guy was a creep, okay? But when the federal agents tapped the phone, they were breaking illegal searches and seizures according to the Supreme Court. And he was convicted of illegal transmission, but that was overturned in this case. The Supreme Court said no, there was no due process of law. They did not go through the proper process, okay? Now, are there places that the police can stop you and search you without a warrant? The Supreme Court said yes. In the Michigan Department of State Police versus Sitz in 1990, they said sobriety checkpoints where all of the motorists are briefly stopped to check for signs of intoxication. That is not an illegal search or seizure according to the Supreme Court. Yes, ma'am. Okay. It is a public telephone booth, and we're going to get to some public records here in a second, all right? But it wasn't the fact that the records were, like, the number that the guy called was public record, but the conversation that the guy had was a private conversation. So they could not get access to that private conversation without just cause, without a search warrant. Now, they could have gone to a judge and say, we want a search warrant to tap the phone. And the judge could have granted that or could have said, no, you can't do that in that situation. Okay? In fact, in Smith versus Maryland in 1979, the Supreme Court said Americans do not have an expectation of privacy as protected by the Fourth Amendment in the records of their calling history because such records are held by a third party. So, if you have a cell phone or a phone and someone else is keeping the records, that is not something that is private information, okay? All of you use the internet, okay? Is your search history private? No, it's a public, according to the Supreme Court, based on this case, that would be something that is public and could be, connected to anyone. They could look it up. Now, exclusionary rule, what happened in the case of Weeks versus the United States? The Supreme Court said the exclusion of evidence that has been obtained through illegal search and seizures from trials, okay? So the Supreme Court said if you do not follow probable cause, you do not go through due process in obtaining search warrants, any information obtained without search warrants has to be thrown out, has to be excluded from the case, okay? And so we have all the great TV shows where the bad guy gets off at the beginning of the show, right? Because there was something, his lawyer found a loophole in the law and they let him go. And so Walker, Texas Ranger just goes to the bar and beats him up. Is that probably how it works? But that's called the exclusionary rule. And then Mapp versus Ohio placed the exclusionary rule applied to the states. Okay, the Supreme Court determined logically, constitutionally necessary for the exclusionary rule to be applied directly to the states. I'm sure they used the 14th Amendment for that. However, in United States versus Leon in 1986, the Supreme Court said, okay, if someone didn't put a period on the search warrant, that's good faith. The mistake was not made, because they were doing something illegal. It was simply a clerical error, okay? And the Supreme Court found that evidence should not be suppressed if an officer acts in good faith when carrying out a warrant that is later determined to be invalid, okay? So we do have that as part of the exclusionary rule. Yes? That is Miss Mapp. You're going to have to do some more work. You have to look up Mapp versus Ohio and come back to us on what she did and what the case was all about, okay? Because I don't know. Yeah, I know you were asking me the question. You ended up with homework. Okay. All right. All right, we're going to go. Amendment number 5 says this: no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Is there enough squeezed into this one little amendment? There is a lot in this amendment. Let me try and summarize it for you, okay? No person can be held for a long period of time unless indicted by a grand jury. The evidence saying that you are guilty has to be brought to a court very quickly in the process. You can't just be locked up and sitting there, at least on the federal level. No person accused of a crime and acquitted can be tried again for the same crime. We call this double jeopardy. If you have been tried, you have been acquitted, you can't be tried again for the same crime unless new evidence can be brought forth, and that evidence has to be presented to a judge, and the judge has to determine if a new case is going to come up. So you can't be tried twice for the same crime. No person can be compelled to testify against himself. We call that our Fifth Amendment rights. You have the right to remain silent. You can't be forced to testify against yourself, okay? And we kind of summarize those again and keep going. No person can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, and no person shall lose private property for public use without just compensation. Let me go back and talk about two of those. The due process of law. No one be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay? The plain reading of the clause would seem to indicate that it only deals with procedural matters. Okay? If you have done this, this is the process that you are taken through in order to be found guilty. If you are found guilty, this is the process. You know, this is how you go to jail. That's all set up by law. It's called due process of law. Originally, that was the intent, that the government had to have laws on the books saying how you would be tried, how you would be deprived of your property, fined, jailed, whatever, okay? But the Supreme Court liked to extend this. Now, originally, Joseph Story said, in effect, affirms the right of trial according to the process and proceedings of common law. That's the original understanding of this, but the Supreme Court has long ruled, however, that the term due process refers to the substance of cases as well. And what happened is the Supreme Court used substantive due process to rule against the Defense of Marriage Act in United States versus Windsor in 2013, okay? So what happens? Defense of Marriage Act. Here's what was going on. There was no federal definition of marriage. So Congress passes a law saying that in the eyes of the federal government, that marriage is between a man and a woman, okay? And therefore, if you are a federal employee and you have a wife or a husband, you are entitled to certain benefits. That would be the right word, okay? What happened is Miss Windsor was married to her wife. Okay, in Canada, she came back to, I believe it was Connecticut, and when her wife died, the federal government taxed the estate that she was inheriting. And she said, this is not fair, because if my wife was a husband, I wouldn't have been taxed. And the court said, well, according to Congress has defined what a marriage is on the federal level. And so when this case went to the Supreme Court said, well, the substance of the case is not right. The Congress has no right to define marriage. Marriage has been left up to the states. I know all the rest of you think, what about Roe versus Wade? What about all these other cases where they took it away from the states? But the Supreme Court said, in this case, marriage is something that is determined by the states, not by the federal government. Therefore, the federal government cannot define marriage. Therefore, Miss Windsor wins the case, and I think it was $365,000 was refunded to her, which is what she had paid as an inheritance tax in this inheritance case. So the Supreme Court has used that phrase, due process of law, to get into lots of different areas where that wasn't the really original intent of due process of law. Another phrase in here, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, okay? Anybody know what we refer to this as? Go ahead.
Eminent domain?
Yeah, the law of eminent domain, okay? And basically, the Supreme Court has placed few limitations in the ability of state and local governments in the taking of private property for public use. If the governments can determine that it needs to be for public use, they can take private property. Rick, I'll put you on the spot. When you were a supervisor at Richland Township, did you guys ever invoke eminent domain?
Twice that I remember.
And what was going on? What was the case?
Well, one of the takings got us the roundabout.
Okay. So you took a couple of inches of somebody's yard.
Took a whole house.
Okay, never mind.
By the way, the person was very willing, because we
Okay.
actually paid 10% above. We offered them 10% above.
So in that case, you went to the person and said, would you sell their house? And they said
Well,
yes.
they were moving away from a traffic jam in front of their house every day.
Right,
so.
okay.
And the other case was just like maybe a couple feet. It was a line of sight triangle for a new road that was cut through.
Right, and so it was a couple feet. Okay, I mean that's an example. I mean,
every road you traveled on
right.
was
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying there is an example of eminent domain. Okay, but what has happened in the case of Kello versus New London? This is Miss Kello, by the way. She owned a home in New London, Connecticut. I believe she owned it for over 30 years, and the city of New London wanted to put up a shopping mall or a strip mall where her house was, and they invoked the law of eminent domain. We were going to take your land and we were going to transfer it over to this other private company that's going to build the shopping mall. That's going to bring in jobs to London. And the Supreme Court said that is totally okay. It's okay for the government to transfer property from a private individual for another private individual for the purpose of economic development, okay? Paul, I feel the same way you do looking at your face, okay? All right, you know, but this is just where we're at, what the Supreme Court said in that case, okay? Yes?
Was it 5-4?
It was a 5-4 decision, yes.
Okay.
Right, yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, wasn't it like 40 states banned eminent domain in the state?
Okay, so it went after Kello versus the United States, was it Kello versus New London? There were, I believe it was 37 states that passed laws saying that even though the Supreme Court says this is okay, our state is not going to do it. We're not going to allow the transfer of property from private individual to private individual for economic gain. Obviously, Connecticut was not one of the states that did that, okay? So, no, this is the federal government telling local communities what they can and cannot do. The danger here is not that the federal government is telling them what they can do, it's that the federal government is saying this is okay. It's okay for the city of New London, therefore it's okay for the city of Sellersville, city of Percy, city of, keep going on. There was the city took the property from one person, from her, and they gave it to a developer who was going to put businesses into that house or into that spot.
I feel like that definitely should be.
I feel the same way. Julie.
Is the person who has to take, did that woman get reimbursed?
Yes, right. In fact, the amendment says it without just compensation. And like Rick said, normally they offer market value. You say you offer 10% more than market value. Obviously, that becomes a big contention. You know, what is market value for your place? You know, but yeah, it has to be. They have to be compensated. What's that?
We got appraisal.
Right, you get an appraisal, and you know, and so. Did I answer your question? Okay. Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right of a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Okay? So, the accused must have a speedy and a public trial. Public trial is important because that keeps the government from just throwing you in jail for whatever reason for trumped up charges. The trial by jury in the state where the crime shall be committed. Once again, it needs to be where the crime was. Why? Because the people in that area understand the situation better than someone farther away. All right? Boy, there's a lot in there. I think we're going to move on unless somebody has a question about that one. Josh doesn't have a question, so we're good. Okay, everybody's good. All right, let's go. Amendment 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of common law. If you sue someone on the federal level, you have the right to trial by jury, okay? You can ask for, I want people that are my peers to hear this case and determine guilty or not guilty, okay? And what's that? Now, that was changed by law. I believe it's now $75,000. That is the new, $75,000 is the new $20. It's the same as it was back in, 1792, okay? Nothing tried by that jury can be re-examined, okay? All right. Number 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted, okay? So, no excessive bail, all right? What is bail? Bail is when you have been accused of something, you go to the judge says you can leave on whatever it is, $10,000 bail, you provide the $10,000. When you come back for the trial, you get the $10,000 back. The government cannot give you an excessive bail just to keep you in jail. No cruel and unusual punishment. What is cruel and unusual punishment? Okay. They have to go put quarters in the machine and push the buttons to call their Will's like, don't do that to me. I gotta walk to the corner to talk on the phone. This could be cruel. Yes. What's that? Torture. Okay. Now, here we go. We're going to get our Bibles open and we're going to answer this question. Okay. Is the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment?
According to the Constitution, no.
Okay. Oh, you say according to the Constitution it's a no.
Oh.
Rick.
Well, death penalty itself is not, but they got rid of public hangings, and then I think the last one was the 1930s.
Okay, so.
They now society deems that as cruel and
All right. So, is the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment? According to the Supreme Court, the answer is yes. Okay? In the case of Furman versus Georgia in 1972, the Supreme Court said that the death penalty was unconstitutional because it was applied in an arbitrary manner. The case of Furman versus Georgia took place in the state of Georgia, obviously. Mr. Furman was accused, he was sentenced to death, and the Supreme Court said he cannot be executed because the death penalty is been applied in an arbitrary manner. There wasn't very specifics about the death penalty. Okay? So, that decision invalidated the death penalty laws in 39 states. Okay? So the Supreme Court said, yeah, cruel and unusual punishment, you can't have the death penalty. So 39 states that were using the death penalty now, 1972, no death penalty. Okay? So, is the death penalty cruel and unusual punishment? Okay, no, according to the Supreme Court. All right? So, in 1976, in the case of Gregg versus Georgia, Georgia was told your laws are arbitrary, so Georgia went to work and rewrote their laws in line with the guidelines from the Supreme Court. And in this case, the Supreme Court said the revised death penalty law is now constitutional. So now death penalty is back on the books in Georgia. Okay, so you can see the Supreme Court, when they start applying these things to state cases, can put a lot of confusion out there and misdirect things. But for us, the more important question for us is, what does God think about the death penalty? He likes the death penalty, according to David. Okay, all right. Josh says it's a necessary evil. Okay, what should be our guide on the death penalty? Old Testament or New Testament? Oh, okay. All right, here we go. Let's start out in the Old Testament, okay? So, when I teach government, this is where I start, with this verse, Genesis 9:6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. This is God establishing government. This is the first verse about government in the Bible. Is it near the front or the back? Okay, it's pretty much near the front. Okay, in fact, this is before Exodus, Leviticus. This is before the law. This is before Abraham. This is before Moses. This is God saying, when someone murders somebody else, that person is going to be put to death. What is God's foundational idea for the death penalty? Why should it be used? Okay, the only way to pay for life is another life. By the way, it's answered in this verse, right? What is the last phrase of this verse? For in the image of God made he man. Okay? We are made in the image of God. We are God's representatives here on earth. So when somebody murders somebody else, they are directly attacking the image of God. God does not take that very lightly. And God requires that someone sacrifice their life in the case of murder. Okay? Exodus 20:13 says, thou shalt not kill. Now, it's pretty interesting that people use that to say, well, that obviously shows that we shouldn't have the death penalty. Because God said don't kill. If the government kills, they're breaking God's law. That's not what God is saying there. The word kill there is referring to murder. In fact, Jesus addresses that in the Sermon on the Mount, where he goes back, he quotes this verse, then he talks about murder. So Exodus 20:13, God is commanding thou shalt not murder. And guess what? God gives us commentary. One chapter later, he gives you all of the laws. Now he tells you how to carry it out. He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. And he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. By the way, that's kidnapping, right? The punishment for kidnapping is the death penalty. He that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Okay? So God is using the death penalty in a very serious way in Exodus chapter 21. Okay? Leviticus 24:17 says, and he that killeth any man shall surely be put to death. Now, did God create a city of refuge? Okay, it's an interesting study. That's another study at a time, right? But God created the city of refuge so that if someone was working and they accidentally killed somebody else, they could run to the city of refuge. And by the way, a city of refuge didn't free them from the court system. They would go to the city of refuge, and there they would be put on trial. And the judges there in the city would determine if that person was guilty or not guilty. Okay? If they were determined guilty of murder, guess what would happen to them? They would be put to death. If they were determined not guilty, what would happen to them? What?
They have to remain in the city of refuge.
They go to jail, right? Not jail as we think, right? But they had to stay within the city walls until the year of Jubilee, okay? Why? Because God looked at man as being vitally important, and we need to be extremely careful. Yes?
God condoning self-defense, right?
This is God condoning self-defense. Yes, we dealt with that last week, okay? And here, this is referring to the city of refuge here, Numbers 35. And if he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die, he's a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he smite him with throwing a stone wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he smite him with a hand weapon of wood wherein he may die, and he die, he is a murderer, he shall surely be put to death. That is right in the chapter about the city of refuge. If that person flees, and this is what the court determines happens, then we invoke the death penalty. Yes, sir.
Accidents, like you get in an automobile accident,
Right.
you kill someone by accident.
Okay.
We call it manslaughter, don't we?
Yeah, we do, right. And you go back to Numbers chapter 35 and addresses those things. But even in those cases, the person, if they were found not guilty of murder, they still had to stay within the city of refuge, which kind of, like once again reinforces, hey, life is precious. Life is very dear. Life is extremely important to God, okay? Deuteronomy 19:11 and 12. But if any man hate his neighbor and lie in wait for him and rise up against him and smite him mortally that he die and fleeth into one of these cities, then the elders of this city shall send and fetch him thence and deliver him into the hand of the avenger of blood that he may die. There you go. We got extradition in the Bible. All right. Someone runs to a city of refuge, but they're guilty. They get returned to be executed. Okay. Now, I know all of you out there were like, that's just the Old Testament. Okay. What about the New Testament? Does the New Testament, because 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is all about what? I'm glad you're paying attention this morning, at least some of you. Okay. It's all about love. The New Testament is all about love. Well, let's read what Jesus said. Matthew 19:17. And he said unto him, why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. He saith unto him, which? Jesus said. What did Jesus say? Thou shalt do no murder. What is Jesus doing in this case? He is pointing this man. This man comes back to him and says, hey, what laws am I supposed to follow? What's the first one that Jesus mentioned? Thou shalt do no murder, which then you go back and, Exodus 21 goes with that. Numbers 35 goes with that. All of the laws involved, Jesus points right back and he says, hey, here is law number 1. Thou shalt commit no murder. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament that he came to abolish. No, he didn't come to abolish it, okay? He came to fulfill the Old Testament, okay? Numbers chapter 13, great passage from the New Testament about government. It says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same, for he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to" what? "Execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." And then it goes on to say, well, what are the laws that we're supposed to obey? And verse 9 gives those laws. "For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in the saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So this is our New Testament passage on government. It says that rulers are to be what? A terror to evil. They bear not the sword in vain. That's some pretty serious stuff, right? That government, when people are doing evil, they should fear government. And when people are doing right in God's eyes, they should not be afraid of government. I had a friend of mine, he worked at Rockview State Penitentiary. He told our deacons were one night where they were complaining about their job, and he said, "Listen, I work with 3,000 people who want to kill me every day. Don't tell me your job is bad." And I didn't know this, but he has absolutely no weapon to defend himself when he walks the halls of Rockview State Penitentiary. They don't give him a gun because what happens if, the guys outside have the guns, right? And the guys inside just walk around with a radio. That's intimidating, okay? And he came to me and said, "Pastor, man, I really have a hard time sharing my faith in the prison." I said, "Wait a minute, let's look at Romans 13. What is your job in prison? You are not bearing the sword in vain. You are God's avenger. You are God's executor in that prison. You're the government. You're representing the government in there. Your job is not to be nice. Your job is not to show the love of Christ in that prison. Okay? Your job is to, carry out God's punishment on these people. That's your job. Not a job I would want. Okay? But obviously it was a job that he did. And are there people that have to do these nasty jobs? Absolutely. Okay? I would not. I know I have friends who are police officers, friends who are guards. Not a nice job because you're dealing with people who are always trying to break the law and skirt the law. Okay, so let me ask you this question. Does the death penalty exalt life or does it cheapen life? Okay, you all said exalt life. Give me, what is your logic?
If you kill someone, you're going to get killed.
Okay, well, but the opponents of the death penalty will say, well, that's just cheapening life. If government's just randomly killing people, then you got to give me better logic here. Okay?
It puts the price.
Okay. Rick, what are you saying? I think you agree with these guys here.
It puts the price of killing a life another life.
Okay.
As high as
Right. You're putting the price, right? God's system of justice is based on restitution. If you stole somebody's cow, you were supposed to pay back 4 cows. Okay? By the way, there wasn't a lot of jails in the Old Testament, okay? Because it was simple restitution. If you steal somebody's grain, you have to pay them back grain. Well, what happened, Pastor, if you couldn't pay it back? You became their slave until you worked off your debt. God's system is sounding better all the time, right? Okay, and you start to think about the long-term impacts. But there were crimes that you could not pay back, okay? Obviously, murder was one of those crimes. You kill somebody, how much is that person worth? Okay? They're not, and today you have these judges, we made this case, so-and-so owes this person $3.4 million for hurting their child. Okay, that really cheapens life. Now you know what they're worth, okay? And so the death penalty is exalting life by pointing out a couple of things. Number one, this is how much it is worth. And then number two, if you are going to violate this worth, you are going to have to give up what is most precious to you. And you are going to have to pay the price. Now, today, our death penalty today is really skewed because you get, sometimes 20, 30 years between a conviction and an execution. So, it's definitely a messed up process, and a lot of that has to do with appeals, a lot of that has to do with politics. But you begin to think about in America what you would be telling people about the value of life by using the death penalty in a very serious way. I know the media doesn't focus on the person that was murdered. They focus on this murderer person. Oh, it's so horrible that they're going to be. Well, what about all the people that they killed? Well, we don't want to talk about that because then it starts to put a price on life. Any questions about the death penalty? Yes, sir.
Yeah, a few years back, there was a big story or scandal. There were several people that were deemed to have been innocent later that were executed, and it caused some hardcore governors who were pro-death penalty to really take pause. So I think there's also an ethic in our thing. Better to let a guilty man go free than to kill an innocent man.
And
so I don't know how you parse them a little bit, but I don't think
right.
you want to see an innocent person killed.
And the other thing you also, it's easy for us to flip through a PowerPoint and, be like, okay, here you go, point 1, point 2, But what if they put the switch in your hand? Here's the death penalty switch. You flip it, that person dies. I'm not volunteering for that job, right? And that's why our government officials, number one, that's where God's help. Lord, help me in this situation. I know when I was in criminal justice class, the teacher emphasized the number of cases that never could have been solved without God's intervention. And a lot of the most famous cases, like if you read about crime cases, the criminal does, police officer was driving down the road and this guy is jumping out of his car and grabbing a body out of his trunk. And how did that just automatically, randomly happen? God was working to bring those people to justice. But yeah, you better be sure if you're the person doing the justice, I'm doing it right and I'm doing it systematically in a right way. But then when you are called upon to bear the sword for God, that's a serious duty. And it's something that, not a duty I'd be signing up for, but definitely a duty that would be needed. Yes, sir. Does repentance play a part in this? I don't think that it does. Okay. Right? It's a good example. Paul was forgiven. I think in this situation where, are there people on death row that have repented? Yeah. Are there people in jail that have repented and turned back to God? Yeah. I believe it's Charles Colson runs the Colson Center. He said the best thing ever happened to him was being convicted of crime and sent to jail. He repented in jail. He got out. But Cain also did his murder before Genesis 9. And you know what? Is there room for repentance in God's world? Absolutely. Certainly. I mean, we could go through examples, right? Moses was a murderer. David was a murderer, okay? We have, multiple murderers that God forgave. And yeah, repentance can play a part in that as well. Yes, sir.
With those cases in forgiveness, it was also that was like God's intervention, I guess you could say. It wasn't.
It wasn't man.
It wasn't
doing
man
that,
making
right?
that choice.
Yep. It would be better when God makes the choice, right? Josh.
What do you think life imprisonment is a good alternative for the life penalty?
I think life imprisonment is a horrible alternative because it takes someone. I think our prison system, the way that we use it, is definitely detrimental to both our society and to the prisoners. Basically, when someone commits a crime, we should have a way for them to pay for that crime quickly and be able to move back into being a responsible citizen. If they can't pay for that crime quickly, in the case of death penalty, they should be executed rapidly. And you look at the Old Testament way. What was the Old Testament way? Well, you have to restore. So you start to think about, if you steal from someone and they have to restore, it is going to change your whole system. I know I was talking with a man, he ran a check cashing business in New Jersey. One morning, one of the people behind the counter called him up, like, hey, someone just walked in here and stole $42,000. He told the person on the phone, he said, you better come up with a better story by the time I get there. And by the time he was there, the police were there, this lady confessed she was actually the one that stole the $42,000. He never got his $42,000 back. She never went to jail. The $42,000 went into evidence somewhere in New Jersey, and she got, some misdemeanor felony, and he never got anything back. That really doesn't make any sense. In fact, all of these fines that people are paying, who does the money go to? I'm not sure where the money goes, okay? But where should the money be going? It should be going back to the person okay, all right, well, you can't pay it back. Well, good, here's a good work spot over here. We'll send you over here to this work spot until you've paid it off, and that money's going to go back to that person. That's God's system. If we implemented it, that would change our whole system pretty rapidly. Yes, sir?
The death penalty is very sparsely enforced.
Right.
We had I think the average is around 7 years
right.
in jail for a death penalty. Rick, I'm sure, remembers a case where a fellow from his area followed his wife down to above Benny Shaw's there and shot and killed her in the parking lot.
Right.
And I think he was out within 7 years, and I delivered oil to him again.
Right.
And
yeah. It's crazy. Right.
That was certainly out and out killing.
And that's the problem. Our justice system is not, rightly, properly prosecuting, persecuting those that are committing crime. Yes, sir?
I read somewhere a few years ago, we're a country of about 330 million people, and we have about 3 million incarcerated at any given day.
Right, yeah. So that,
and 1 out of 100.
Right, and that's a whole nother discussion, is the whole criminal justice system. But let's go on, Amendment number 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Okay? So the Founding Fathers want everyone to understand, if those rights are not listed in the Constitution, that can't be used to deny other rights to the people. Okay? The purpose of the 9th Amendment is to clarify that the Constitution was not written to limit the rights of the people, but to limit the power of the government. And that the Bill of Rights was not an exhaustive list of rights held by the people. The people retain many rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution, and the government has no power to interfere in these rights. Okay? So, what do you got? You got any rights that you exercise that are not listed in the Constitution? The right to play video games, okay, all right. I would put this down. You have the right to exercise your free will. That might be a good choice, or that might be a bad choice. But you have that right to exercise your free will. Yes, sir?
The right to go to sleep.
Okay, you have the right to go to sleep in peace, yes.
Have the right to pray to God?
I had the right to pray to God. That is listed in the Constitution, however. That's in Amendment number 1, yeah. Okay, the right to drive on the road, is that a right?
No.
If the road is provided by the government, they give you a license. I don't know that I would put that down as a right, because we're talking about, this is like, wait a minute. What rights do I have that aren't in the Constitution? Let me give you some others. How about this one? The right to have children. Not listed in the Constitution. Definitely a right given to you by God. Oh, we like this one, right, kids? The right to work hard. I'm not getting much response up here from the front row, okay? Get a lot of response in the back row, okay? The right to work hard, the right to provide for your family. That's why so many people came to America, is because, hey, you want to work hard, there you go. You got that opportunity. Yes?
So the right to travel.
Okay? Right to travel.
You may have to go by foot, but you got the right to travel.
Okay, the right to travel, go by foot, whatever, all right? How about this one? The right to be creative. All those of you that like to draw while I'm talking, okay? That the right to be creative. I know in the Constitution talks about copyrights. You obviously have the right to profit from that creativity, but just because it's not listed in the Constitution doesn't mean you don't have that right, okay? And so the Founding Fathers wanted people to understand that. Finally, Amendment number 10 says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectfully or to the people. So the 10th Amendment, the last of the Bill of Rights, says, if it's not in the Constitution, the federal government should not be dealing with it. It should be left to the states and to the people, okay? We all like that one. Rick even mentioned it earlier, okay? This is a great one. It is, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution or prohibited to the states, they're reserved to the states respectfully or to the people. Now, the 10th Amendment is an important reminder of the need to preserve the powers of the states and the people against the encroachments of Congress. Now, in the United States versus Sprague in 1931, the Supreme Court said that the 10th Amendment was intended to confirm the understanding of the people at the time the Constitution was adopted, that powers not granted to the United States were reserved to the states or to the people. It added nothing to the instrument as originally ratified, okay? So the Supreme Court said that if it's not there, that's just part of the document. So here's a question for you, okay? If the 10th Amendment tells Congress that it has no right to get involved in things that are not mentioned in the Constitution, why is Congress constantly passing bills about stuff that's not in the Constitution? We could spend all night listing stuff, right? Okay. I'm sure we could, there's no herbicides mentioned in the Constitution, right? Okay. But I'm sure that's a big part of your business, is dealing with how does the federal government pass laws regarding herbicides, lawn growth, lawn care, okay? How about education? The federal government passed a lot of laws about education. Health care is one that just came, recently. The federal government is passing all kinds of laws about health care. How can they do that if it's not in the Constitution? Yes, sir. Palm Sunday.
Jesus was like being lauded as a hero, and the people really wanted him, and then 4 or 5 days later,
Okay.
people turned on him.
You're giving that as an example. But here's how, okay? Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribe. So Congress says, all right, if we have the power to regulate commerce within the several states, we have the power to regulate health care because it's commerce within the states. If we have the power to regulate commerce within the states, we have the power to regulate herbicide because it's being produced in one state, it's going to another state. If we have the power to regulate commerce with among the several states, we have the power to tell colleges what they can and cannot teach because if students from different states are going to these different colleges, okay? And so Congress used this, it's called the Commerce Clause, to basically apply anything in your life to the federal government, okay? And the 10th Amendment has rarely had the opportunity to fulfill its potential. It was not until the mid-1800s that the Supreme Court even began to apply it to specific cases, okay? And in the United States versus Darby, the Supreme Court determined that the amendment was simply a truism. Now, I didn't know what the word truism meant, so I had to look it up. It simply means it's a cliche. It's not something that people actually believe or do. It's just something that is stated within the Constitution. And because of the Commerce Clause, the 10th Amendment is simply a cliche, not something that really is going to be is applying. And to me, I would certainly disagree with that, and I think it's sad that Congress is using all of these things because, one thing my father told me, he said, whenever you debate with a liberal, just simply ask them one question. What has the federal government done that works? And why is it hard for the federal government to pass things that work? Because our country's so huge. And, something that works in Pennsylvania may not work in Wyoming, may not work in Delaware, and you have Congress getting more and more and more involved in things. All right, I'll open up. Any questions you got? Constitution, the Christian, okay? Yes, sir.
We're not talking about the 14th Amendment, are we?
We're not going to get to the 14th Amendment. I'm sorry, we ran out of time. But why would you bring up the 14th Amendment?
Because that's what made everything apply to the states.
All right. So, all right, so the Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment to apply a lot of what's in the Constitution or limitations on government to the states. And so it would be one we get to, but we're just out of time. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, would you say the Bill of Rights was totally in the context of the period of 1770 to 1776? For example, like the right to quarter troops?
Did the amendments come from that time? Absolutely.
Yeah, but a lot of them were built in reaction to
Right,
that
right.
period.
Absolutely. In fact, you go back to the Declaration of Independence is a list of rights. The Olive Branch Petition in 1775 was a list of rights and a violation of rights. So, yeah, the Bill of Rights was certainly a reaction, and we could, if we had time, we could go with historical examples for every one.
Like
Okay.
quartering troops is, it's not an issue, it never will be. And
Right.
What military would want to
Right.
quarter the troops all
Right.
over the...
But a lot of those court cases were like, you look at those Bill of Rights, you're like, wait a minute, why does the government want to protect people who got thrown into jail?
Because they were thrown into jail unjustly.
Ah.
Unjustly for a lot of spurious reasons.
Right. Back in 1776 and earlier, England was taking people and not letting them be tried in America, was shipping them over to England where they could control the courts. By the way, there are different governments today that are trying to use indictments for political reasons. They're trying to take an indictment and, oh, somebody's over here doing this, so let's bring them over here and let's indict them for this, and now they can't oppose us, okay? By the way, that's what totalitarian regimes do, right? The opposition runs for office, you bring laws and lawsuits against them. I was in Kenya in the KANU party. I went through KANU party headquarters. It was about 10 years later that they raided the party headquarters. We found out there were torture chambers under my feet when I walked through the KANU party, the headquarters there.
Oh,
Yeah.
one other thing about the quartering of troops, there were some British soldiers that didn't want to go back.
Yeah, there were many British soldiers that didn't go back, both ones that were in prison, and there were definitely lots that stayed because they saw the opportunity.
Hey, it's not that bad over here.
Right, right.
I would disagree with the fact that they only apply to 1777.
No, he's not saying they only apply. He's saying that's where they came from. They originated in the abuses of the rights of English people in the late 1700s. Yes, ma'am.
There's such a fight today about the Constitution. Do you ever foresee that they will do away with the Constitution?
I wouldn't be, that would not surprise me at all if people get away. I mean, I think that the number one danger would be, hey, let's have a convention where we improve on the Constitution. And then you would have, okay, we're going to get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this. And really there's this push for democracy in America where we want to get rid of these different parts of the Constitution. And the number one way to do that is through judicial activism and through the Supreme Court. And that's what the court has really started doing, starting really in the 1930s, just eroding the rights of the people and giving more and more power to the federal government. And we've seen that problem, building up in our lives since then. That's why I want you to understand what it is. Yes, sir.
Yeah, who is the Avenger of Blood in the Old Testament?
Normally that was a relative of the person who was murdered. That someone in their family would be the one that executed God's law on that person. Does that answer your question? But it also makes you think, now wait a minute, we got it easy in our country, right? Because if your brother was murdered, God's law says it's your job to execute that person. I assume then it could be your job to give them forgiveness too. So, but definitely, and once again, what do we have the emphasis on? It's individual responsibility. Oh, us doing our job in front of God. Yes, sir.
Is kidnapping a repayable crime?
Is kidnapping not according to God, not according to Exodus? It's not. Kidnapping is not a repayable crime. So, all right. If you got any more questions, you feel free to call me, come visit me, whatever. I'll talk to you about government. I'll talk to you about U.S. history, as long as you want, okay? I also would encourage you, if you get the opportunity, take some time, visit the Constitution Center down in Philadelphia. I like to look, they have a bookshelf there showing you all the books that influence the Constitution. And you'd be surprised at what they are, okay? but definitely good books. And once again, we go back to the text. What does the text of the Constitution say? So let's go ahead and let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you and praise you for how good and wonderful you are to us. We thank you for our opportunity to be together tonight. We just ask that you would guide us and help us to be Christians who are understanding things from your word and being guided through your word especially. Lord, we just praise you for the freedoms we have in this country. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. You are dismissed tonight.